Welcome to Wildcat Science with Mrs. Hugo. This is Chapter 9 on the nervous system, and this is Video C. Let's look at what's going on inside of the cell during an action potential. So as we know, the neuron at resting is negative on the inside of the cell membrane, and we have more sodium ions on the outside of the cell membrane and more potassium ions on the inside of the cell membrane. So once a stimulus hits, which we'll see is happening over here, there will be a change. But before that time, the sodium-potassium pumps are working to send out sodium out and potassium in. Then over here, we have a stimulus happened, and the sodium ion channels open up, and then the sodium, since there's so many more sodium here than there are here, the sodium ions rush in, and that makes our inside of the cell positive. That's called depolarization. It was polarized, and now it's not. So the inside of the cell is positive, way up here. And then our potassium ion channels open up, and then potassium rushes out of the cell because there was a lot more potassium ions inside the cell compared to outside the cell, and nature always wants to equal things out. And then and that's called repolarization, when the positive potassium ions move out. And then the return to resting potential, which we said was stage 4, is our sodium-potassium pumps get busy, and they take sodium out of the cell, so that's a higher concentration outside the cell, and then pump potassium back into the cell to reestablish its negative on the inside, positive on the outside, and there are more sodium ions on the outside and more potassium ions on the inside. So that's what happens during an action potential, and we know an action potential happens in one spot of the axon, and then it moves to the next spot on the axon, and then the next spot, all the way down the axon until it gets to the end of the axon, and then something new has to happen before that signal can go to a second neuron. And the place where that happens is called the synapse. So we know that neurons don't work alone. There are a lot of neurons that have to work together to get the signal from your brain, let's say to your toe, to tap your foot. A synapse is a point of junction between two neurons. And the information must be sent from the axon of the presynaptic neuron, so the neuron before the first neuron, to the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron, and that's the second neuron. And messages only travel in one direction. They always go from the first neuron to the second neuron. They don't ever go backwards. So when an action potential comes to the end of the presynaptic neuron, it releases a neurotransmitter, which is a chemical messenger, into the synaptic cleft, which we know is that space between the axon of one neuron and the dendrite of the other. It's a little teeny space in the nervous system. So neurotransmitters connect to protein receptors on the dendrite of the postsynaptic neuron, and this causes a response in the next neuron, in the second neuron. Usually causes an action potential to move down its axon, keeping the message going. During class, we're going to revisit our CPUP biology page to look at this synapse happening. Okay, you're going to use your brain synapses. Okay, AHIMNOTUVW. Which of the letters above does not belong with the rest? Which one is different than all the others? Take a minute and write your answer down. Did you get N? Okay, let's take a look at our axon. So we have the first neuron, which is the presynaptic neuron, which has the cell body and the dendrites, and then the axon, which if it had white fatty material on it would be the myelin sheath, and then the spaces in between would be the nodes of Ranvier. And we come here and we have the end of the axon and then the dendrite of the second or postsynaptic neuron. So this is the synapse, and that little space between is the synaptic cleft. So let's take a closer up view of the synapse. As we know, we have the first presynaptic neuron with the axon and the myelin sheath, and then there's the synapse, which is here, and it's going to take a lot of power. So we've got our mitochondria, and then we have our vesicles holding neurotransmitters. When the action potential gets here, it tells these vesicles to release the neurotransmitters into this postsynaptic cleft, into this synaptic cleft. And then there are membrane proteins, receptor proteins on the dendrite of the receiving cell that when the neurotransmitter binds to those proteins, the signal is sent into the cell. Okay, looking, here's a real view of a synapse. We can see the mitochondria and the synaptic vesicles and then that little synaptic cleft. Okay, so please write this down. Neurons can synapse other neurons. As we have been talking about, a neuron can synapse with another neuron. Previously, we talked about neurons synapsing with skeletal muscle at the neuromuscular junction. And then in the next chapter, we will be talking about neurons synapsing with glands during the endocrine chapter. So what could possibly go wrong? Nervous system disorders. Our first disorder we're going to talk about is a concussion. That is a mild traumatic brain injury that is due to an impact to the head that causes the brain to hit the skull. The brain is about the consistency of gelatin or jello, so you really need to protect it, and if it hits the inside of the head of the skull, some repercussions can happen. How do you know if you have a concussion? Well, loss of consciousness after a hit means you have a concussion. Headache, vomiting, or impaired brain function, these all could be clues that you got a concussion. How do you treat a concussion? Rest. You need to rest from physical activity and you need to rest from mental activity. Your brain needs to heal itself, so you do need to take that part seriously. How does one prevent a concussion? Well, whenever you're playing sports, wear the protective gear, and whenever you're in a car, wear your seatbelt. Okay, a second disorder we're going to talk about is multiple sclerosis. And if you remember from our reading, Sue has MS or multiple sclerosis. This is a degenerative neuromuscular disorder, which means it will get worse over time. It involves neurons and muscles. So the myelin sheath around the axon is damaged, and then some of the nerve fibers are damaged. So what does that involve? So this is the insulation that makes messages go faster. So it's going to slow the speed of nerve impulses. It interferes with nerve signals in the brain and the spinal cord. So there are impairments in your sensory information that's going from usually your limbs to your brain, and also it impairs the motor output that's going, so there are some movement issues. So this is usually diagnosed relatively young, between 20 and 40 years old. You can live with it for a number of years or decades usually. Symptoms: how would one know if they have multiple sclerosis? So weakness, muscle weakness, a loss of balance, a sensory deficit. So if you have like numbness or tingling in a hand, involuntary muscle spasms, pain and fatigue, and if you notice cognitive problems. Okay, what's going on with multiple sclerosis? You can see in a normal neuron, we have our myelin sheath, but in multiple sclerosis, this myelin has been damaged, and that really hurts the message going through that axon and causes problems. Why does this happen? We don't know for sure. It's thought to be an autoimmune disorder. How does one treat it? Well, unfortunately, there is no cure to MS, but there are drugs that slow the progression of the disease and also drugs that will treat the symptoms of the disease. A third disorder is Parkinson's disease, which is a degenerative neurological disorder, so it gets worse over time. And actually, neurons in certain parts of the brain are dying off. It is characterized by tremors, particularly in the hands, rigidity of limbs and joints, impaired balance. There is a characteristic shuffling walk, and also a loss of facial expression. Some people call this a mask-like face. So what is happening? The brain doesn't produce enough of the neurotransmitter dopamine that transmits messages from the brain to the muscles. This usually occurs at about 60 years old or older, and there is no treatment. There is no cure, but there is treatment. So drugs that mimic dopamine will slow the symptoms of Parkinson's and allow you to live a normal life longer. So let's look at what's going on here. We can see we have a normal neuron with a large amount of dopamine, neurotransmitter dopamine, and then you get normal movement of the limbs. Whereas in Parkinson's, this neuron has been affected and there is just a very little amount of dopamine, and so we get not normal movement. We get movement disorders. How does one prevent Parkinson's? Well, there is research that shows regular exercise will reduce your risk to get Parkinson's. However, we don't know what causes Parkinson's, so the prevention is a little bit harder to come by. But we know the risk factors. Age, being over 60, men get Parkinson's more often than women, and there seems to be a correlation with exposure to toxins, like ongoing exposure to herbicides and pesticides increase your risk for Parkinson's. Our fourth and final disease is Alzheimer's. This is also a degenerative disorder, and it's caused by the gradual degeneration of neurons in the cerebrum, particularly the cerebral cortex and the hippocampus, which are important for learning and memory. So, symptoms of Alzheimer's disease: memory loss, some cognitive impairment, so speaking, thinking, remembering, stuff like that. Mood changes, perhaps some symptoms of dementia like confusion, emotional disturbances, the inability to function on your own. Again, there is no cure for Alzheimer's disease, but there are drugs that will delay the symptoms from getting worse for a longer period of time. How could you prevent this disorder? Regular exercise, having a healthy diet, getting quality sleep, managing your stress, giving yourself mental stimulation so that you keep learning things, and having an active social life. Not an active social media life, but an active social life where you're physically seeing people and doing stuff with people. Okay, as you can see from this brain, this is a normal brain, and then the brain with Alzheimer's, there are neurons that have actually died, and so you have less of your brain. So brain cells in people with Alzheimer's disease have an accumulation of a protein, which is called an amyloid, and neurofibrillary tangles in neuron fibers. That is how we diagnose it. Unfortunately, you can't diagnose it until someone's dead, but we can look at their symptoms. So there is a correlation. The more education you have, the lower your risk of getting Alzheimer's, especially if you learn new things in old age. Some examples are learning a new language or learning to play a new instrument. So let's practice on your brain. Write your answer down Did you get 55? Let's talk about Sue in class, and we're done.